Happy Tuesday, everybody. Welcome to another episode of China Update, where we discuss leading political, economic, and geostrategic analysis on the world's #2 economy. My name is Tony. Let's jump in. Now, it's the second day of the US-China Stockholm talks. As of recording, they are ongoing, so we will do a deep dive into the results and implications of these talks in tomorrow's video. First up for today, the Chinese economy. According to official data published yesterday, China's industrial profits shrank for a second consecutive month in June, showing the growing pressure on manufacturers as authorities vow to curb aggressive price competition and counter the effects of US tariffs. The National Bureau of Statistics numbers showed industrial earnings fell 4.3% from a year earlier, following a 9.1% decline in May. Profits for the first half of the year dropped 1.8% overall. Beijing is increasingly focused on combating what it calls disorderly competition, a politically correct term or a euphemism for overcapacity, with policymakers warning that rampant price cutting, known locally as involution, is eroding margins and fueling deflationary risks. The government has pledged to phase out outdated industrial capacity and stabilize prices, a signal that has already pushed up costs of commodities like polysilicon. It's not just a huge domestic issue, however. It is one of the biggest issues driving China's trade surpluses with other markets, fueling global trade restrictions. Jens Eskeled, president of the EU Chamber of Commerce in China, after EU leadership visited Beijing last week, told Chinese financial media outlet Caixin that the oversupply issue is one of the biggest challenges facing China's economy. Quote, "Everyone talks about consumption, but actually there is consumption growth in the market in China. The problem is that for many months we've seen that manufacturing output has been growing faster than consumption." End quote. On these new data, Peking University Professor of Finance Michael Pettis observed yesterday, and this is worth unpacking at length, quote, "Beijing wants to prevent what it sees as disruptive pricing competition by limiting the ability of businesses to compete on prices. But I do not see how they can succeed. Price cutting is not the problem. It is simply a symptom of the problem. Businesses are not cutting prices out of malice, but because they produce far more than they can sell domestically. And although they are aggressively turning to increasingly reluctant foreign markets, they still rely on domestic demand for the bulk of their sales. Because China is unable to accept the short-term economic and employment impacts of closing down the least efficient producers and is instead swamping them with additional credit, the supply-demand imbalance won't change even if businesses are no longer able to compete on prices. The resulting rise in inventories, of course, must be financed with rising debt. And what would happen if businesses were no longer able to cut prices? To the extent that they can sell consumer goods, it means that one of the most effective ways of raising real disposable income has ended. Lower prices effectively transfer income from businesses to households. That would mean slower growth in consumption. To the extent that they sell goods to other businesses, the higher profits for the seller mean lower profits for the buyer, so that there would be no change in overall business profits, just a change in the way profits are distributed. There are only two solutions to excess capacity. One is to raise demand, which has proved impossibly difficult. The other is to reduce supply, which means closing down production facilities and firing workers. The problem with the second solution is that as workers are fired, demand declines even further. And although demand won't decline as fast as supply, the danger nonetheless is that the resulting economic contraction is bigger than expected. This is what the US faced in the early 1930s. In the end, you cannot solve a structural problem through accounting or administrative measures. What we are instead likely to see is greater trade surpluses and rising inventories, with the former being the main way to reduce the latter. End quote. Next up, China sees flooding across the country every year. It's a common feature of the summer months. However, this flood season is getting especially concerning, with even outlying districts of the capital, Beijing, seeing deadly flooding, forcing General Secretary Xi Jinping himself to issue special emergency instructions. Torrential rains are sweeping across northern and eastern regions. Beijing has been among the hardest hit, with authorities confirming at least 30 fatalities after days of relentless downpours inundated outlying districts. In Miyuan, a mountainous area northeast of the capital, more than 21 inches inches of rain fell, accounting for 28 of the reported deaths. On Sunday, inflows to Beijing's Miyun Reservoir hit an incredible record 6,550 square meters a second, requiring an emergency flood discharge, which we are watching now. 2 additional victims were confirmed in Yanqing, another rural district of Beijing. State broadcaster CCTV reported that over 80,000 residents of the capital have been evacuated as dozens of roads were washed out and power was lost in 136 villages. Beijing raised its highest level flood emergency alert, ordering the suspension of in-person classes and construction work while urging residents to stay indoors. Xi Jinping issued urgent instructions as the crisis escalated, emphasizing that China is now in the critical, quote, July-August high-risk window, end quote, for flooding. He called for all-out efforts to rescue the missing, evacuate threatened populations and minimize casualties, while urging officials to strengthen monitoring and early warning for extreme weather. National flood control authorities have been instructed to intensify patrols of rivers, reservoirs and dams and identify urban waterlogging risks to prevent further tragedy. Heavy rainfall has also battered neighboring Hebei and provinces including Jilin and Shandong, where sudden downpours have caused additional fatalities. In Shandong's capital, Jinan, half of the year's rainfall fell in just 5 hours last week, killing at least 2 people. The floods recall the 2023 massive rainfall that brought Beijing its heaviest rains in 140 years, underscoring the vulnerability of the region to extreme weather. Forecasts warn that the downpours will continue in the coming days, keeping much of northern China on high alert as rescue teams race against time to protect lives and property. Now, if you want to be on top of these updates, which we'll be following in the next week or so, as the country braces for what could well be devastating floods, as well as general China analysis, make sure you're subscribed to China Update. If you're getting some value from today's episode, don't forget to hit the like button and share this with someone who you think would also get some value. Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee links are also in the description for those who want to help keep the channel financially sustainable. I rely heavily on this as well, and unfortunately in the last few months this number has also dropped a little bit, so this is also a huge help. Thank you so much, everyone, for the incredible ongoing support. Next up, China has unveiled a nationwide childcare subsidy program in a bid to counter its plummeting birth rate, pledging to provide annual payments of a modest 3,600 yen, $502, for every child under the age of 3. The plan, issued by the State Council, will cover up to 3 children per family and is set to benefit more than 20 million households each year. The policy, retroactive to January 1st, 2025, will be funded through a new central government fiscal transfer program. The move comes as China grapples with a 3rd consecutive year of population decline. Births fell to 9.54 million in 2024, almost half of the 18.8 million recorded in 2026, when the country ended its one-child policy. United Nations projections warn that China's population could drop to 1.3 billion by 2025 and below 800 million by the end of the century. And this is just a conservative estimate. Some demographers argue that the population collapse will be much more devastating. While Beijing has previously offered tax breaks and expanded daycare services, the childcare subsidy marks its most comprehensive national effort yet. However, analysts caution the measure will likely be insufficient on its own. Quote, "The subsidy is likely too modest to stem a decline in new births, but can be useful in boosting sentiment and consumption," end quote, said Eric Zhu of Bloomberg Economics. The policy also highlights shifting social dynamics. Marriage rates have plummeted to their lowest level in nearly half a century, dropping from 13.47 million couples in 2023 to just 6.11 million in 2024. At the same time, the average age of first marriage has risen from 24 years old in 2010 to almost 29 years old in 2020, a trend that threatens further declines in births, given that most children in China are born within marriage. And finally for today, yesterday we covered the news that Taiwan's ruling DPP campaign to recall 24 KMT legislators failed completely, as all 24 retained their seats after Saturday's voting. Since then, Taiwan's President Lai Ching-te has received more bad news. The Trump administration has reportedly moved to block Lai from transiting through New York on a planned trip to Central America, a decision seen as a concession to China amid the delicate trade negotiations which are, as of recording, ongoing. The UK-based Financial Times first reported the denial, which sources said followed direct objections from Beijing. Lai had intended to visit Paraguay, Guatemala, and Belize, three of Taiwan's few remaining diplomatic allies, with a brief stopover in the United States. But according to people familiar with the matter, Washington informed Taipei that Lai would not be permitted to enter New York. Shortly after, Lai's office issued a statement citing Taiwan's recovery from a recent typhoon and ongoing talks with Washington over tariffs as reasons to postpone any overseas travel. The episode comes as the Trump administration seeks to keep trade discussions with China on track. Several insiders, including veteran China analyst Bill Bishop, who we often quote on China Update, have said that they have heard that the United States has also cancelled the annual defense policy dialogue with Taiwan, signaling a broader effort to avoid provoking Beijing. The move risks leaving Lai politically exposed at home, where critics may frame the episode as evidence of shrinking US support. It also raises strategic questions. Will Beijing respond by easing military and grey zone activities around the island, or see the decision as leverage to intensify pressure on Taipei? With trade talks between Washington and Beijing ongoing, the fallout underscores Taiwan's increasingly precarious position as great power diplomacy plays out over its future. Okay, that is today's episode of China Update. Thank you so much everybody for watching. Have a good Tuesday, and I will see you for another episode tomorrow.